Well, I try not to speak in cliches, but our next speaker has just had an absolutely meteoric career. Angela Riley is a professor of law at Southwestern Law School. She's currently visiting at UCLA Law School, if you're trying to track her down. She received her BA summa cum laude in letters from the University of Oklahoma and her JD from Harvard University. She's a member of Phi Beta Kappa and a member of the California State Bar. She was a veteran litigator when she joined Southwestern's full-time faculty in 2003, and she was also named that year as a justice of the Supreme Court of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation of Oklahoma, also of which she is a citizen. That court hears all civil and criminal appeals arising from the Tribal District Court. She holds the distinction of being the first female and youngest justice ever to serve on the court. In addition, she has served as an evidentiary hearing officer for the Morongo Band of Mission Indians. She's a recipient of the Wilfred Bibb Scholarship awarded by the Citizen Potawatomi Nation and a former co-chair of the Native American Law Students Association at Harvard. She served as a judicial clerk to Chief Judge Terry Kern of the Northern District of Oklahoma in Tulsa. In 2007, she was named as the Irving D. and Florence Rosenberg Professor of Law. She's focused her recent scholarship and presentations on protection of Native American intellectual and cultural property, and she has participated, or she's spoken all around the country on rights of indigenous peoples and social justice law. So I'd like to welcome Professor Angela Riley.
See
how we get the PowerPoint up.
There we go. Oh, great, thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. You can tell the Public Relations Office writes those things, right? I mean, they make you sound so much better than you are in real life. It's really wonderful to be here. I am from Oklahoma, born and raised, and it's great to be home, and it feels like home. And I did spend a year in Tulsa doing my clerkship, so it's nice to be back in the area. And it's such a privilege and an honor to be speaking in front of so many friends and colleagues and mentors and people who've really guided me and helped me, and you all know who you are, and I thank you. I also wanted to just thank the Gilcrease and also, of course, Tulsa Law School for hosting and inviting us all here and putting together this great collection of scholars. And just wanted to mention, although I agree with you that only academics probably read academic work. I do have a relatively recent article that's going to be coming out in the Yale Law Journal in a couple of weeks that I co-authored with a very good friend of mine who's on the afternoon panel, Kristen Carpenter. And it's called In Defense of Property, and it focuses a lot on these issues. And it's very lengthy, so I won't hold anybody to actually reading it. But if you want to, it talks a lot about this stuff, and we'll flesh out more about what I'm talking about today. So what I would like to do, let's just see if I can navigate this this here. Let's see. Let me see where. Let's bring it down here. Aha. Okay. So I usually move around a lot, but I'm going to try to stay at the microphone so you can hear me. See, I have too much going on here. All right, so I'm going to focus my presentation today. Hopefully it'll build off the other presentations that we've had. My presentation is very simply called Indigenous Peoples and Cultural Property. And what I really want to do is back up a little bit and talk about cultural property outside of the indigenous context, where it started, and of course being a law professor, talk about the law of cultural property, how the law of cultural property began, why it's so complicated, and why there is a whole international dialogue about cultural property going on, that indigenous cultural property gets brought into and gets situated within internationally that complicates the issues for indigenous peoples. So when you're outside of really the four settler nations that have been mentioned before, including the United States. A great deal of the dialogue about cultural property is happening internationally, and much of it is happening in Europe. And a lot of those conversations, and especially the philosophical and theoretical conversations and debates over the role and scope of cultural property, really is situated completely beyond the indigenous context, but we get brought into it because those debates affect us, obviously. And so I want to back up a little bit and talk about how cultural property really came to be and how it bears on us. So just to begin very simplistically, it's already been mentioned that cultural property traditionally, this is sort of a lay definition. It's referred to tangible resources bearing a distinct relationship to a particular cultural heritage or identity. And because of the cultural significance, these tangible resources, which would include documents and works of art, tools, artifacts, etc., were thought to transcend ordinary property conceptions and to merit special protection. So one of the big advances that's happened with cultural property that has been mentioned is the move from tangible to intangible. And by intangible, I mean those things that would be covered in sort of American legal terms under intellectual property law. Copyright law in particular, which would affect songs, stories, dances, productions, designs, and of course patent, which affects a lot of really complicated scientific issues about mapping human genomes, farming techniques, traditional knowledge, and those kinds of things. I'm going to focus mostly on the tangible in this presentation, but the intangible issues sort of raise a whole other set of concerns. This definition we're sort of taking as a given from the beginning of our conversation that there is such a thing as cultural property and that there ought to be. But for many people, and I think academics and scholars, but also activists and people working in this field, there's a very strong pushback on the concept of cultural property in and of itself because it's presenting the idea that there is a people that can stand in for the individual and assert some kind of legal connection to and perhaps even right to and control over property because it's so intricately linked to a culture that's tied to a people. And that concept, although we've kind of taken it as a given, is not intuitive to many people and is a concept that there's a lot of pushback on. For a lot of reasons that you might have already, may have already thought about. What does it mean for a people to have a connection to property? Who are the people? How do we define the people? How do we know which version of the people asserts the cultural property, the right to the cultural property? In the United States, with indigenous peoples, it's slightly less complicated because we have federally recognized Indian tribes who have their own governments. But with indigenous groups around the world, it can be very complicated. Oftentimes, they're not organized in the same way that U.S. tribes are. Sometimes they have, oftentimes they have less recognition from the dominant society in terms of their own sovereignty. So it's very difficult in many other instances to determine the people. And of course, the very nature of culture itself. It's fluid. As the doctor so beautifully pointed out, it's fluid, it's hybrid, it's constantly changing, it's in flux. What is the culture? And so part of asserting a connection to cultural property is making a statement about what your culture is. And culture is a very difficult thing to define, and its tangible and intangible objects also very difficult to define. So let me just give you a little bit of the background and a rather simplistic description, an example of cultural property. If we think about the United States, we might say the cultural property of the United States as a country might be the Liberty Bell or might be the Statue of Liberty as a couple of examples. We're a relatively new country, we're a relatively young country, so we don't have a lot of cultural property of our own outside of indigenous cultural property. And as a result of that, by being both a young country and a very rich country, we are, in cultural property terms, a market nation. We're a nation that buys and collects a lot of the world's cultural property to house in our own museums. There's an enormous amount of property, artifacts in American museums that were taken from other parts of the world. Some perfectly legitimately, some probably not perfectly legitimately, and I'll get into a little bit of that later. But as a result, in the United States, we are a market nation. We buy cultural property. And in the international market for art and antiquities, there is a divide between market nations, which tend to be quite wealthy and have less of their own cultural property, and source nations, which tend to be nations that are much poorer, often in the developing world, from which a lot of this cultural property comes. So you can see this divide happening in the world in terms, along many different axes, along axes of race and ethnicity, along axes of impoverishment, socioeconomics, in terms of political power, dominance, etc. So just to give you a little bit of the law, since I'm a law professor, I always go back to the law. Let me give you a little bit of the law of cultural property and how it developed. If you study sort of the history of cultural property law and its formation in the world, one of the first appearances that you'll see of any actual indications and definition of cultural property will be in the Hague Convention. This is post-World War II and was really enacted and developed in large part in response to a couple of things. One was the intentional destruction of a lot of very significant monuments, including churches and temples during the Second World War. Structures that would be considered cultural property and that were cultural property when they were destroyed, even though the term wasn't really identified at the time. And also, of course, the atrocities of the Holocaust, in which I think brings up some of the complicated issues of cultural property, where a lot of the fine art and artifacts belonging in particular to Jewish families in Eastern Europe was taken from them as people were sent to the camps. And then the effort of people subsequently to try to recover those items for their families. So really, the Hague Convention is one of the first articulations that we have of cultural property. It is meant to prevent looting during wartime, and it has come to express what we call the cultural internationalism approach. And then I have there in parentheses cosmopolitanism. This is a view that, that there is no identifiable thing as a culture. There is no Potawatomi culture. The Potawatomis express through their art and their stories and their life a whole set of beliefs and systems and things and objects that really are just a massive incorporation that they've taken from other peoples over time, and that there is no such thing as a defined and distinct culture. And so really all of the wonderful richness that you see in a museum belongs to all the people in the world. We have all mixed together. There is no clearly defined culture. We all borrow from each other, and this is part of the beautiful fusion of humankind. And so all of these things belong to all humankind. They don't just belong to Potawatomis or just to Americans or just to the Greeks. And so this is the Hague Convention. Then UNESCO was passed or was drafted in 1970, and this is another major step in cultural property because it began to define cultural property much more on a cultural nationalism view. Much of this being advanced by European countries, which tend to be very rigid about concepts of cultural property in regards to nationalism, and I'll talk about a couple of those in a minute. But this is really more of a repatriation view. It's the idea that what is Greek, and it should be in Greece, and the Greek people should have control over it, and they should have the ability to preserve it and present it to the world in a way that is representative of their Greekness, even if contemporary Greeks may have some distinct differences between the Greeks who created the cultural property. So it's more of a repatriation view. It's more of a nationalistic view. This gets incredibly complicated, that I'll get to later in my presentation, for indigenous groups who, as we all know, tended to not be active in the formation of the modern state, tended to be pushed aside in the development of the modern state whose territories formed around us, and we now find ourselves minority populations in dominant societies that don't necessarily reflect us. So with most of this legal dialogue happening in regards to nation states, you can see why it becomes more complicated for indigenous peoples. And I have some concrete examples of that. And then I just have a few more things that I wanted to point out. UNESCO 2003 extended this to intangible objects, which is very important for indigenous peoples. A lot of the debate that's going on right now, and the reference, of course, to Michael Brown's book, Who Owns Native Culture, a big part of that book is inspired by his very deep skepticism about the ability of indigenous peoples to control intangible cultural property. And then I've mentioned the UN Declaration, which has already been mentioned, of course, which also provides protections. And then I have in the United States, and these are just a few examples, we have the National Historic Preservation Act, the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, and then I have NAGPRA, which you've heard mention of many times, which was passed initially in 1990. And I also have the Indian Arts and Crafts Act, which is before the language of cultural property was even really in our dialogue. The Indian Arts and Crafts Act was passed, as many of you know, to essentially be a truth in almost a consumer protection law, that if you were going to say these are Potawatomi earrings, they have to actually be Potawatomi earrings, which means you have to actually be Potawatomi. So that's just almost a consumer protection type of law, but it does relate to cultural property issues. Okay, so how does all of this relate to my larger point? Well, if you look at what's happening internationally, much of what's going on in the cultural property debates internationally are really very clear vestiges of, as I think other people have pointed out here today, a period of decolonization and struggles over power and people's ability to define themselves to the world and to express themselves to the world. And probably one of the most famous examples, and probably kind of the quintessential cultural property debate and debacle that's going on right now, is with the Elgin marbles. Sir Elgin in the 1800s went to Greece, which at the time was occupied and being controlled by the Turks. The particular legalities of the situation in each of these situations, they each have their own story for how the artifacts were taken. Sometimes legally, sometimes illegally. Sir Elgin went and got the artifacts, took the what they call the marbles off of the Parthenon. The Turks said it was okay, purportedly. He takes them back to England, and they have been housed in the British Museum for most of their existence. The Greeks have been trying to get them back for decades. The Greeks say this is core to who we are as the Greek people. We want to be able to get them back. We want them repatriated. We want to represent them to the world. For many, many years, the response has been that they cannot be properly cared for in Greece, that we have to think about the preservation of the marbles. The British Museum has said they have the ability to care for them in a way that the Greek people simply do not, and repatriation would mean their destruction, and it's much more important to preserve them than to repatriate them under some kind of quasi-ethical duty, when the British believe that they actually have the legal rights to them in the first place because the Turks had the legal right to sell them or to give them away. And so they have sat in the British Museum, and this is a battle that has gone on for a long time. Interestingly, one of the arguments that gets raised by the British is that they've been in the British Museum for so long that they now actually are the cultural property of the British. That the British people have as much of a connection to them because of their placement in their home country for so long, that they're more closely tied to them than contemporary Greeks, whose culture, according to the British, is not closely enough aligned with the Greeks who created the Parthenon to justify repatriation. So this is kind of a core example of this battle over, you see, the cultural nationalism and the cultural internationalism. And there are other examples that are really powerful. This one, I think, raises a lot of issues that map onto the struggle of indigenous peoples to try to repatriate. This is an example of a Nok sculpture which was discovered in Nigeria by the French. The Nok people were an ancient people. They were located in the area that is now geographically considered the nation of Nigeria. They apparently don't have a cultural or racial connection to contemporary Nigerians. They're a culture that was extremely advanced. Much of what we understand sort of about modern man has come from understanding these cultures in this region, and the Nok were one of them. And Nigeria has said, these sculptures were plundered by the French in the territory that is now Nigeria. We're in a post-colonial world, and we want them back. And you can't keep them in the Louvre. You have to return them to Africa. And the French say, similar to the other example, you, as the ruling class of Nigeria, have no more connection to the Nook people than we do, and we're preserving them for all of humankind. And this represents a true, the Louvre is a universal museum. We don't just represent French culture, we represent cultures of all the world, and we do it in a way that's proper, and we have the resources to preserve these things for the future, and you do not, and you have no greater claim to them than we do, and we will not return them. And so this is one of the battles, and another one is the Rosetta Stone, where Egypt is also trying to get the Rosetta Stone back, and it's also being kept in the British Museum. So you can see how these debates are playing out, and one of the issues that arises is that the international instruments that deal with these situations really involve nation states, which are the groups that can be parties to the conventions. And so what you have is nation states standing in for the people within their borders to claim or seek repatriation of cultural property. That becomes very complicated if you're a group within a nation state that can't be a signatory to an international convention, but that may not want your voice to be put forth by the dominant society in which you've been consumed. And you see that tension arising throughout the world. And I have an example at the end about Machu Picchu that I will tell you more about. So we all know in this room, because of our relationship to indigenous cultures, whether we're indigenous or just have a relationship to indigenous cultures and museums, that our relationship as Indian people with museums has been incredibly fraught over time. And I want to just give you a few examples and talk about how this international dialogue is mapping on to struggles of indigenous groups to try to recover cultural property from museums. And at its most basic fundamental level are human remains. And the first example that I'm going to give you is one that you are all probably familiar with. It's been highly published and talked about. It's an old case, but it is the case of Ishi, who is a man who was taken to a museum as a living specimen. That means, I believe it was I want to say the mid-1800s, I don't have the exact date in front of me, that with the gold rush and the mass genocide of Indians in California. Many Indians were killed through disease, many with bounties on their heads during the gold rush period. Ishi walked out of the woods, believed to be the last person in his tribe, the only one to survive. And he walked out of the woods into the arms of famed anthropologists, some of whom apparently were good people, befriended him, really did care about him by all accounts. And he walked out of the woods and they said, "This is the last wild Indian." And Ishi was taken to live in a museum to be a living specimen, so that when you could go browse the halls of a museum, you could see a human being. And he would show you how he lived and what he made. And here's a picture of him with a hut and, different little things that they say he made, so you get to see how this specimen lives. And of course, he's a human being. This is a quote by the chairman of the Redding Rancheria, who said, "They called him Ishi in our language, Pit River. East means man, and our people are called the Iswai people. That means Abalone or Shell people. So if they called him Ishi, it's because he was saying, I am a man, I am a human being." If that doesn't just send chills down your spine, nothing will. But of course, we look at this and we say, but this is the past, and museums don't have this perspective anymore, and there's been so much education, and things have changed so much, and all of this is absolutely true. And NAGPRA was unbelievably powerful, and has been powerful, in creating the space for the repatriation of human remains in particular, as well as funerary objects and items of cultural patrimony from federally funded museums, to return to indigenous cultures. But obviously it hasn't worked 100%. I mean, we all know of the massacres that have led to thousands and thousands of indigenous human remains being housed in museums. And I just wanted to highlight this example, that today, this is an old picture, but this is a contemporary fact. The LA Times reported on this story on its front page in 2008. There are 12,000 sets of indigenous remains still buried beneath the Hearst Gymnasium swimming pool at UC Berkeley. And Indian tribes in California have tried to no avail to get those remains repatriated under NAGPRA. And you might ask, well, how how can it be possible that they can have these remains and they haven't repatriated them? And I've spoken to people who've gone into the area where they keep the remains. I've never been there myself. And it is, as Rebecca Sosi said this morning, it's just drawers full of body parts. There isn't enough room to store them as full skeletons. And so you just have a drawer full of femurs, and a drawer full of mandibles, and a drawer full of teeth, and a drawer full of skulls. And that's how they're being kept. There is a scientific exception provision in NAGPRA that says no body can be repatriated until scientific studies have been conducted on it. So these are not part of an ongoing scientific study. They're just being housed in the museum. How can they not be repatriated? Well, there are two legal obstacles. And the legal obstacles are that California is home to many non-federally recognized tribes, both through termination and just through the process of settling California and how California became part of the United States. There are many tribes there that are very tiny, and many tribes there that have no land base and have no federal recognition. And so they're unable to use NAGPRA to repatriate. And the other problematic issue is, even for those that are federally recognized, there are issues of cultural affiliation. It's very difficult, and I think Rebecca talked about this earlier today, it's very difficult for a lot of these tribes to demonstrate cultural affiliation to the human remains, particularly if they're ancient remains. And so those are the two legal obstacles, but what's the philosophical obstacle? What's the real theoretical and philosophical obstacle that's underneath this? And I think that it ties into the international movement. I think particularly with ancient remains, there is a sense that ancient remains are really the property of all humankind. They're not just the property of individual tribes, even if they're not part of an ongoing scientific study. These anthropologists and museum curators, obviously not all of them, but in some instances, really dig in their heels and feel like their job is to collect these things and to preserve them for future generations, even if at present they don't have a particular use for them or don't want to display them, that they should be preserved because they might unlock the secrets about the world and about all of us. And so they're really the property of all humankind, and that no culture can lay claim to these things. And to do so is to take a very myopic and limited view of the world. And that international debate, the internationalism and nationalism, really maps on to this debate in the United States about people saying, if we have a body that is 5,000 years old, why should any one particular tribe have any greater interest in that body than the museum? And I think a lot of this ties back to once again, to the doctor's presentation, to the idea that American Indians have always been seen as a resource for non-Indians. What we can give to them, that we can be a specimen for them, that they can learn from us, that they can create a myth about the founding of the country based on the backs of Indians. And it all ties in together. The lack of political power, the lack of representation, all ties in together to the myth and the idea that these bodies don't really belong to any particular group, although if they were non-Indigenous and could be tied to direct descendants, they would have been returned a long time ago. So this brings me to the end of my presentation. The question I have here is nationalism, cosmopolitanism, and how do we fit into this? And let me just leave you with one final example that really highlights it. And once again, each of these cases is really unique and particular. So if you actually wanted to kind of mine the legal ramifications in any one particular case, you'd have to do a pretty detailed examination. The situation with Machu Picchu is no different. Based with funding from National Geographic, explorers went to the ancient Incan city of Machu Picchu and began to take artifacts out of the city. They were taken out. They had an agreement with Yale University. They went into a museum in the Yale University Museum. Almost immediately upon their removal, Peru tried to get them back. Yale said that they had an agreement, that they actually belonged to Yale, and this is a fight that's going on. There's federal litigation about this right now, about whether these artifacts will go back to Peru or not. And one of the interesting questions from my perspective is not just the question of the legality of the removal of these particular artifacts, but the question of who speaks and who should speak for the cultural property. And I think as Indigenous people, we understand that having the nation state speak on your behalf might not be any more meaningful than having another dominant culture speaking. In other words, if Peru gets these artifacts back, what will it mean for the descendants, if any, of the indigenous culture from which they were taken? So Peru as a national government may choose to represent its indigenous history in one way. But what you're seeing in indigenous communities, and there's been talk of this today, is a real desire on the part of indigenous groups to create their own museums and to tell their own stories. So it's not enough that it goes back to Peru, but that it actually goes back, if possible, to descendants of the people from which it came. So they can actually have a pivotal role in telling their own story and representing themselves to the world. And that really, at its core, is what cultural property is about. It's a story of colonization and dominance and people's ability and desire in a post-colonial age to have a say in the way that they represent themselves to the world. Thank you very much.